Thank you. Thank you all for coming out tonight, and thank you, Walker, for giving us this wonderful space. We've been talking about very local issues. I'm gonna expand the aperture a little bit and talk globally. On December 31st, 2017, I was on a plane between New York and Jerusalem, specifically to have a very hard conversation. Now, about 2 months earlier, the 2016 elections had occurred, and I'm going to be honest, their results had unmoored me a bit. Because so much of the presidential campaign had hurtful rhetoric targeting the Muslim community. I am Muslim, by the way. I know it may seem confusing, but I am Muslim. So after the elections, I was having a real existential crisis. The stories I had used to tell about myself as a Muslim and as an American no longer seemed true. They felt like they lacked imagination. So here I was on a plane traveling towards Jerusalem. Now I wasn't alone. I was on the plane with 23 other Muslims from North America, and we were going to Jerusalem to learn about Jewish peoplehood. Now, this may not seem like a big deal. People go to Israel and Palestine all the time. But for Muslims, going to Israel is often a no-go zone because of the occupation of Palestine. And for Muslims and Jews here in America, in interfaith situations, the occupation is always the elephant in the room. But the elephant almost always brings falafel. So Muslims and Jews will sit at the same table and eat falafel and say, "See, we're eating falafel together," as if that's some sort of kinship. No. All it means is that falafel is good. Right? So it was weird for me to be going to Israel to learn about Jewish peoplehood, to learn about Zionism. I was breaking some sort of unspoken rules of engagement, but after the election, I was so hungry to run towards the heat. I was so tired of the same conversations and the same stories. I was longing to encounter a new opening, and it could have happened with anybody. It could have been a really conservative Republican, but life or fate or whatever you want to call it gave me Jerusalem, and I took it. Now, this whole experience was very counterintuitive because, for one thing, Muslims and Jews had to agree to radical honesty with each other, which meant we had to let the elephant walk right on up and take a seat at the table. The other thing that I had to agree to do is listen to a story that might make me feel pretty uncomfortable. And I also had to commit to being comfortable with my own story in order to be an honest participant. Now, let me tell you how this works. During our time in Israel, we went to meet to speak with a far-right Israeli settler. His name is Mr. Weinberg. Not his real name, don't Google him. He lives in the largest settlement block in the West Bank. Now, Mr. Weinberg chose to start his conversation with us, questioning the Muslim claim to Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, which is also called the Temple Mount, which for Muslims is the third holiest site in Islam and very important to Palestinians. It is the holiest site for Jews and Judaism, so this is a very contested place. And Mr. Weinberg says, "I just don't understand." And he's from Brooklyn. He's like, I just don't understand. Why do Muslims insist on Jerusalem? It's not in the Quran. And there was this, and then one of the Muslim participants, very kindly and very gently said, "Mr. Weinberg, shalom. We came here today to listen to you and to hear your story. We didn't come to tell you your story. So please don't tell us what our story is." And there was this pause, and Mr. Weinberg said, "Fair enough." And then, something amazing happened, right? When we agreed to sit down at a table and let go of ideological litmus test over who we talk to and how we have a conversation, this space of graciousness and vulnerability opened up. When Mr. Weinberg and many of the other Jewish participants throughout the week realized that we really wanted to listen, the elephant in the room finally started to talk. And sometimes the conversations were hard and even heated, and sometimes fascinating and even heated, but they were absolutely real. They were some of the realest conversations I've ever experienced in my life. And I learned some important things about myself. I learned, for one, that I had sometimes inadvertently used anti-Semitic language, which I didn't mean to. I didn't know. I didn't know that my language was hurtful. And my Jewish peers had sometimes used language that was triggering to Muslims. They didn't know. They didn't mean to. But they didn't know because we had never talked, so we didn't know each other's trigger words. So we actually made a list of the words that we found triggered each other, and we had a real conversation about it. And when I come back to America and this moment that we're in now, I realize that these kind of conversations are actually countercultural. Because we all do this, and I'm sure most of us here have done this. We'll say, oh, I'm not going to talk to that person. That person supports Trump or Bloomberg or Biden or whoever. Or, oh, I'm not going to talk to her. She supports Israel. And it's this amazing logic, which I don't quite understand, but I've been guilty of it myself, is that disengagement with people we disagree with will somehow magically fix things. Recently, an imam who went on the trip with us was invited to speak at an Orthodox synagogue. And the rabbi said, I've been in this congregation for 10 years, and this is the first time I've ever had a Muslim speaker. And he could invite this imam because he knew the imam had spent so much time listening that he knew the trigger words and he would be sensitive to the community's needs. I also learned something else, that these little moments like this are magical. They're magical. They're little moments, but they create big potential. Through this experience, I also learned something very surprising about myself, is that empathy is hard work. It is such hard work, and it's not pretty. We think empathy is nice and lovely. You can absolutely empathize with someone who also makes you angry and who frustrates you. That's actually what kinship is. If you're married, you know exactly what that feels like, right? That you can understand what hurts somebody and you can feel their pain even if you are angry with them, even if you see that sometimes they may do things to hurt other people. And I realized too that this is holy work. And now back in Greensboro, I have had to think about this and make a decision about what kind of stories I tell. And this was triggered by I had the privilege of hearing a Palestinian and Israeli peace negotiator recently. And they said, you know, when it comes to a sustainable peace plan, people put too much weight on the negotiators. The problem is not one of politics necessarily, it's one of narrative. Because both sides are unwilling to tell a new story about themselves. And the only way that's going to change is if people at the grassroots learn to listen, engage, and talk. I said, that sounds a lot like America. The problem isn't politics. It's the stories we tell about each other, and those stories impact the stories we tell about the world. So I have a decision to make. I guess we all do. Do I keep telling the old story because it's safe and it's, kind of feels good because it's familiar? Or do I risk being a little bit unpopular and tell a new story? I'm going to tell the new story. I just hope that story comes with a side of falafel. Thank you.